I know the lighting still isn't great here, guys. However, there is some light now. It's not just a black screen. So, alright, I've received a very generous donation, and I will now have a little bit better camera. I'm shooting at night still, so there is still a lighting issue. Hopefully I will be able to get some better lights in here soon. But until then, we're stuck with what we're stuck with, right? Anyways, I'd like to continue the video series, The Races of Thorril. And so far we have covered hill dwarves, which were covered in our introduction. And after we talked about them, we moved on to mountain dwarves. And we discussed the differences between the two races, or rather sub-races, I mean. And we talked about the different weapons they use and why they go for those weapons as compared to different ones. And we talked a little bit about the history of the hill dwarves more in depth than the mountain dwarves. There was a little more to them to explain. And in those videos, I talked about the fact that there is indeed a third race of dwarves. And this third race of dwarves are the deep dwarves. These are dwarves that are nearly completely subterranean. I've already pointed out that my hill dwarves and my mountain dwarves are already a subterranean race. They make their homes in the earth, and they only venture out sometimes. The deep dwarves are different. They rarely venture out. It's not just they only venture out sometimes, they rarely, and they live much, much deeper in the earth. Whereas hill dwarves and mountain dwarves, they dig tunnels and mines and caves and stuff to live in. The deep dwarves retreated into the earth centuries ago. Many, many centuries ago, millennia in fact. And they are in the underworld, pretty much. Not the underworld as in the world of death, but the underworld as in a complete world of cave systems, caverns, tunnels that all exist very deep in the earth. We're talking several miles down. And this is where they live, and so they're rarely ever going to be seen on the surface fighting ordinary races. And when they do, it actually is kind of interesting because of their characteristics and where they live. They can't fight normally on the earth, and I'll get to that. I'll get to their above ground fighting, but first let's take a look at who they are. So the cave dwarves are, like the hill dwarves, about waist height, so I'm thinking about 3 feet tall or so. And that gives you an idea about their size. As far as strength, they are actually different than my mountain dwarves and hill dwarves. You see, my mountain dwarves and hill dwarves I made stronger than humans. Mountain dwarves are about 2.5 times, mountain dwarves are about 2.5 times as strong, and hill dwarves are about 2 times as strong. Now, a deep dwarf is different because it is actually not stronger than a human. The hill dwarves are equal in strength to a human, which is still a big advantage when it comes to grappling, seeing as they're only 3 feet tall and they're just as strong as you. But they don't have that extreme extra strength that other dwarves have. And they don't have quite the same endurance, and they can't take quite as much damage. Now, this isn't to say that they are as fragile or weak as a human. They are, in fact, much stronger than humans. They can take, or not much stronger as far as physical strength, because like I've said, I've already established they're about the same, but stronger in the sense that they can take more damage. And the reason for this is that their muscles are denser, and their bones are much thicker and sturdier. And this is also why they end up being so broad and heavy. Very dense, thick muscles, very dense, thick bones, makes you very heavy and broad, and that explains why, despite the fact that they're not any stronger than us, they are in fact still 3 feet tall and 200 plus pounds. And where they live is, like I said, in the underworld, and being so subterranean, they have taken on a more insect-like mentality. They have a matriarchy instead of a patriarchy like my other two sub-races of dwarves. And what this means is, instead of seeing kings and tracing your lineage through parentage, I know what I'm saying. Rather than tracing your lineage through your father, if you are a deep dwarf, you would have queens and you would trace your lineage through your mother's side. So the women are the ones that are in power. And it doesn't make a huge difference in warfare, but just a difference in the way their society functions as a whole. But we're not overly interested in that in these videos. We're mostly looking at their warfare, just like we're not overly interested in the fact that they are white or black haired and they're very, very pale white skin. And actually, when I say hair, I don't mean hair, I mean bearded, because usually they are bald. And again, that doesn't have any relevance to this particular video, just something that's worth noting about them, because it's a little interesting to know what these things look like in addition to how they function, and it's just a little interesting, I feel. So we've got that. Now, like I said, we want to look at the weapons they're going to use. So, these are dwarves, but they're different than your standard everyday dwarf. I've already established they're weaker than my normal dwarves. They live much deeper underground and are much less likely to come out and have relationships with people. And so this does, in fact, change the way that they are. The fact that they're not always trading, the fact that they're not always at war with people, even though they are a warlike society, the fact that they're so deep underground really limits them as far as warfare goes. They don't have as big a need to be great smiths. They still have to mine really well. I mean, they live completely in the ground. And yes, they do still need to smith, but it's not as big a need, so they don't have that same sense of dwarven pride of they have to use metal weapons. It has to be master crafted and the best that there is. They're happy with good enough. And so they're a little different than what you would normally picture a dwarf in that regard. And I've said in a previous video, actually I'll wait to get to this because it's hard for me. So let's just continue on to the bulk of this video, which is going to be what sort of weapons are they going to use and why are they going to use these weapons as opposed to other weapons. Okay, so the first set of things I want to look at is their ranged weapons. What ranged weapons are my deep dwarves going to use? And what I've decided is the fact that they don't have to be, they're good with good enough, like I've already established. They don't have to have the best stuff, and they don't have to be the greatest smiths and whatever. They don't have to hold that same reputation, and they don't have that same sense of pride necessarily. Well, they're going to look at it then that there's a lot of rocks around them. Everywhere they look, they're rocks. They're deep in the earth. A sling is a pretty good weapon choice then, because you've got pretty much unlimited ammo. And whereas a mountain dwarf or hill dwarf, they want a metal weapon that they made, a deep dwarf doesn't care as much. So I very much think that the sling is actually going to be a deep dwarf's main ranged weapon. That's going to be their go-to ranged weapon. And that's not going to be their only one. They are going to have crossbows. They are good enough to make crossbows. It's not that they can't and that they don't see a use for them, but just that the sling has so much ammo available to them that it would just be, without that sense of dwarven pride, there is no logical reason I can think of to exclude it from their weaponry. And like I said, they don't have that same sense of dwarven pride, so I can't use that as an excuse to exclude the sling from their weaponry. I could say that, well, it's an inferior weapon to the crossbow, and so they could use the crossbow, but the fact that there's just so much ammo available, I don't feel like that would really be the case. Yes, they would use the crossbow, and yes, my deep dwarves do use the crossbow, in fact. But, like I said, there's just so much ammo, I don't think they would choose not to use the sling just because it doesn't have as much killing potential. It still has some killing potential, it has some damaging potential, it's going to be used. And so, like I said, they use crossbows, I covered that already. As for an armor, they're going to be using a plate mail. It's not going to be as thick or strong or as good as a normal dwarven plate mail, but it's going to be comparable to human plate mail, which is still plenty good enough. I mean, it's a myth to think that swords can cut through armor like butter. I don't care if it's a katana, I don't care if it's a great sword, I don't care if it's even a halberd. It's not going to just cut through the plate mail. You're going to have to find gaps in the armor, you're going to have to crush it with blunt force. You can't just slice through it, no matter what weapon you've got. Perhaps through repeated strikes with the axe to the same area, you could chop through it, but you don't have that kind of ability in battle, so not really feasible, and not gonna happen. It's just a myth that you can cut through it. So human level plate mail is good enough, and that's what they're going to use. They're not overly strong, overly great craftsmen and smiths. Human level plate level is good enough, and like I said, this is a race of dwarves that is happy with good enough. Alright, so after that we need to look at weapons. And when I say weapons, we've already talked about weapons because slings and crossbows are weapons, but melee weapons. And really what you need to look at is, what are they going to use in their environment? They're in deep caves and tunnels. They don't have a lot of room available to them. So just like we've decided with the other dwarves, a big weapon is a detriment. They don't want a big polearm because they just can't use it in their caves. They don't want a big sword because they can't use it in their caves. And this is what I was saying a few minutes ago, and I just had to wait because I didn't want to crush myself any sooner than necessary. I said in a previous video that it would kill me to give dwarves rapiers, even though I feel that's the best weapon for them. And it still does, trust me, I am dying inside right now. Really, really bad, like my chest, it wants to stop working. But the main go-to weapon for melee combat for a deep dwarf is indeed a rapier. And it is for the reasons that I pointed out in the previous videos. A rapier is really good for a cramped, narrow space. The fact that it's meant for thrusts instead of swings means that you can use it really well without having to move around much. And I feel it's going to be really well suited for them. And I don't want to do it, but I can't use a personal opinion and bias to completely wreck a logical thing. I want realism here. So even though I don't like the idea of dwarves with rapiers, it makes complete sense. It has to happen somewhere, and this is where I've decided to put it. And so a rapier, along with a parrying dagger, or even a sai, a dwarven sai with a particularly sharp point put onto it, would be their main weapon. They would dual wield these things, of course, because you can't put the dagger and sai in the same hand as your sword, but you would have the rapier in your main hand for attacking, and your parrying dagger or your sai to protect yourself with, since a rapier is not really going to allow you too many options for protecting yourself, really. You thrust and that's about it. But yes, there's more to it. I watched some fencing videos. You'll see there is much, much more to it. I'm not trying to dumb it down and say there's not. It's very impressive. But realistically, you're not going to be deflecting blades with a rapier. You're going to want your parrying weapon for that. And if they don't have a rapier and a parrying sai, or a parrying dagger or knife, what is it that they're going to go with? Well, a short spear, or a short sword. Let's see, is that what I wrote down here? That is not what I wrote down. Oh wow, that got overly bright. You can tell I'm trying to get everything balanced completely using a flashlight and the notebook I have my notes written down on in a dark room. So I apologize for that. I'm trying to keep things like that to a minimum. But not short swords. I don't know why I even said that. I already had established that swords don't work well. Even a short sword's not going to work well. But short spears, again like I did with the previous dwarves, making these about 4 feet max, it's mostly a thrusting weapon. It could be used in a cave. And I also gave them shortened partisans, the 3-pronged spears. That's a spear with 2 prongs going off to the side that are meant to help in parrying. Well, that could be useful since it's a spear for thrusting, and since it's got parrying ability, you can parry with it. So I actually feel that that would be their main polearm as far as if they had polearms. They really don't, because that 3 feet long, 4 feet long doesn't qualify as a polearm in my mind, and probably not anybody else's either. But that would be their idea of a polearm, and they would have their rapiers and their daggers and size as their side weapons. They would want to keep they would want to use ranged weapons as much as they possibly could. They have a limited use in their caves, so they can only use it so much, but they would want to really use that a lot because all they have is thrusts. If you can know how to deal with a thrust, you can deal with a deep dwarf pretty well. They're not very strong, not very fast, and their weapons, they're all designed for one thing. And this is in their home environment. They actually have a different weapon. Sorry about that, dropped the phone. A different weapon that they use on the surface. And I've said in a previous video for why my dwarves didn't change their weapons when they came out of their caves to fight in the open lands, was that if you had spent 10,000 hours training with one weapon and only 10 hours training with another, and you're going into battle and you know there's going to be a lot of fighting, even if the weapon that you've only spent 10 hours training with is generally superior, the one that you've spent 10,000 hours on, you're going to know how to use so much better. That's going to be the weapon that you want to use. That's going to be your choice weapon. And so my previous dwarves would not change their weapons. They would still use their small cave-worthy weapons, even out in a large open field where they could potentially use a larger weapon. However, my deep dwarves do change their weapons. And you might be thinking, well, what's the point for this? You've already established why they don't, and it's a very good reason and makes a lot of sense. So why are these dwarves all of a sudden changing weapons when the other ones don't? And the reason for that is their makeup, where they live, has changed them physically. Like I said, they've got the beards and the baldness and the pale skin, and their eyes are usually very dark gray. But none of that is what I'm referring to. What I am referring to is the fact of how they see. Now, if we're talking about a hill dwarf or a mountain dwarf, they have two kinds of vision. Normally, they see in night vision. This is because they are in dark, poorly lit caves and tunnels, and caverns, and mines. Keep in mind, I just said poorly lit. Not completely dark, poorly lit, so night vision is what they have. And they also have normal day vision for when they leave the caves. Now, both these dwarves have this. The deep dwarves have, for millennia, been so deep underground that their lines of sight have changed, actually. They have their main vision as infrared vision, so they see in heat. And this is because they are so far down that they don't have light down there. They may have glowing lichens or something. They may have torches, maybe. They could definitely make those and bring them down, but they are so far down they don't really have any light. So their main viewing method is through infrared, through heat. And when they go up to farther up tunnels that are closer to the surface and let some light filter in, or if they're in an area where for some reason or another there are torches or glowing lichens or whatever, their second mode of vision is night vision, like the hill dwarfs and mountain dwarfs' main mode of vision, so they see really well in the dark with some light, or they can see in heat vision really well in the complete absence of light. Notice that means that they don't have a normal day vision. Can you imagine how hard the sun is on them? If they see in heat, everything is going to be absolutely blinding to them when they come out into the daylight. It's going to blind them completely. If you have night vision and you're trying to fight in the day, it's almost impossible to see. That means if they leave their caves and they come out to fight in the open, they can't see their enemy. Even if you're right up on top of them, you can't see your enemy. And if you can't see your enemy, you don't want them right on top of you. You don't want to be guessing where that sword's coming at you from. If you can't see it, you don't want it anywhere near you. And so they're going to want very long weapons when they come out onto the surface. They don't want you near them since they can't see where your weapon's coming from and what you're doing with it. So they don't want you near them. They're going to want to keep you away. So a very long weapon. And some long weapons that we can look at are berdiches, halberds, glaives, spears, but none of those are the ones that I picked. And they are all good options and choices. But there's a particular reason I chose this pole weapon that I chose, and it's actually not even a weapon. scratch that. In some cases, such as with gladiators, this was a weapon. However, generally, this was not a weapon, and I'm sure a lot of you know what I'm talking about now, but for those of you that don't, I am talking about the trident. And the trident was generally not used for combat. You would use a spear or something else first. And the reason for this is that there's not a whole lot of benefit in using a trident versus a spear in combat. There is, I guess, a little. I mean, you do have 3 pokey things instead of 1. And that's good to an extent, but not a whole lot. I mean, humans are pretty big and they're pretty slow. It's going to be pretty hard to miss with your thrust. And it doesn't, having 3 prongs doesn't add anything to the sweeping power or anything. So you could parry better, and there is that, but they have the partisan, and that is a more effective design and weapon for that anyways. So I believe that's why the trident just wasn't ever really used. There wasn't ever a real need for it. It didn't offer anything that other weapons couldn't provide the same as, if not better. However, if you can't see, you're much more likely to miss with just 1 pokey thing than with 3. So I believe that with the deep dwarves having such poor eyesight would actually greatly benefit from having the 3 prongs of a trident as compared to the single point of a spear, or even the blade of a halberd. That's really good, but if you can't see your opponent, you can't get blade alignment, it doesn't matter much. If you're just thrusting with 3 pokey things, you've got a really, really good chance of hitting your slow human moving target, or slow moving human target. I know English and sentence structure, I promise. But you don't need to line up anything too much, you just gotta poke out, and they can't see well, so they do have the issue of, can they see their enemy to strike at that long distance? And I feel that even though they can't see the enemy to strike with them, they can still hit them. And the reason for this is that being so deep in the earth, they're very attuned with it. And it's kind of like, for any anime fans out there, Toph from Avatar The Last Airbender. She was a blind airbender, for those of you that don't know. And the way that she fought was she had to see her enemy somehow, and so she learned to see them through the vibrations in the earth. She could tell their movements and whatever. And the deep dwarves have been so in tune with the earth, so deep in the earth for so long, that they can kind of do the same thing. They can't see how you're moving exactly or what you're doing, but they can feel the vibrations and tell where you are generally. So they can hit you with their spear, and they can keep that long spear, they can use that to keep you at a distance. It's got 3 prongs, so even if you're moving and they can't see that you're moving away very well, it's got 3 prongs, they're likely to hit you. The trident would be their main weapon on the surface. And with that being said, they're almost never going to go to the surface. They're never going to use this trident unless they have to. And the reason for this is because, well, if you were going to go into a fight, would you choose to go into a fight in a place where you're blind? No, you wouldn't blindfold yourself before battle. And these dwarves they're smart enough to not want to do that. They want to live. So they're not going to go into an area where they can't see. They're going to stay in their caves, unless they just have absolutely no choice, in which case they go with the trident, because that is their best chance of being able to hit their targets and surviving. Still, they don't want to do this. They're going to take every means they can not to. And probably every male will die before the females actually take it so far as to go out onto the surface. And that's just a little look at who my deep dwarves are. As you can see, they're pretty different from the hill dwarves and mountain dwarves that I've already talked about. I look forward to talking to you next time. This was the last of the dwarves, so I'll have to figure out what race I want to discuss with you next. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, maybe hit the like button and maybe subscribe. This is a new growing channel, and I'm looking forward to making more content and talking more with you about the different races that I'm making. And until next time, have a good one.